Thank you very much, Karsten. So thank you also to both Alexanders and Karsten for sharing your presentation. It's been really fun at this end of the table as well to listen to your presentations. Welcome to all participants, and thank you for hanging in there. I know it's maybe a long stay, an hour and a half. I hope you're still there with me. I hope I can also deliver something that's of value to you. As you can see, I called my presentation The Cultural Advantage, which means that I will talk to you very briefly in about 20 minutes on how we perceive as CMC culture to be an advantage if it is put to correct use. It was already mentioned by Karsten in his presentation where there are at least three main aspects where we have to think about when we are thinking about strategy and successful growth, innovation and other company development, where you mentioned that besides providing value and making sure you have the necessary resources as an organization, a main fail but also success factor is to manage collaboration. In our work, we always look at culture as an advantage, meaning that even though as human beings we tend to have very negative ideas or stereotypes about people that are different than us, we hope and see how can we use this tension and put it into something that is giving value not only to the organization but also to the team and the individuals. I like to use this picture with the little fish in the bowl because I think it really illustrates how even though it's still the same fish, we can be pretty clear that the cat and the baby are not looking exactly at the fish the same way. It's a really bit of a metaphor for how we collaborate in cross-cultural situations. So let me start first by giving a very short introduction of how we perceive culture in the context of individuality. Because if you work with cultural differences, one of the questions that's always asked is, but why do we need to talk about culture? Aren't we all unique? So our personalities, the fact that we were born with our own talents, our own characteristics, our own preferences, isn't that the most important thing? Well, of course, it is a very important thing, and every individual has a very unique aspect, even if we would be, let's say, conjoined twins. They would still have their own personalities. However, culture is, I would say, the mediating factor that is telling us in what context, where do we express personality and what does it mean, for example, in the business culture context. This also means that we do not just look at culture as nationality or whatever is mentioned in your passport. We look at culture as any group membership, every group we're a member of. So it can be your nationality, but it can also be your profession, your age, your gender, and many other groups. The good news is everywhere around the world we share also a lot of things. We are all human beings with certain needs and wishes, emotions. So yes, we do share a lot. We're also unique, but culture is really, I like to call it a little sauce that makes us part of a group and distincts us from other groups. So this is where we place culture in the context of individuality and human nature, where yes, even though we share a lot, we're also unique, but on the other hand, being part of a group is necessary since we are also social animals. This is a positive thing. If you're still in the same group, it works perfectly. However, of course, the last, let's say, half a century, we've been traveling in the world. Technology is giving us the opportunity to talk with people everywhere, like we are doing right now. Which means that we have to find out what do we do if we encounter people that do not share exactly our culture. And this can be an easy thing if we're looking at creativity, but it can also be a very difficult thing if we're looking at general communication and collaboration. This is of course a circular model of cooperation in general. The biggest circle where it says shared norms and values is really a starting point where it comes to where do we like to start if we are working with other people. If we share certain norms and values with the people around us, it makes them predictable. And since we are always looking for predictability, this is building one of the ways of building trust. Which means if I have an appointment with somebody, I know he's going to be on time. Or I know he's going to be late because I would do the same in my culture with my norms and values. It also helps me to understand what I can expect from somebody, how we should communicate, and how we can cooperate in an effective way. However, the world is not this simple anymore, and I think we can all agree that very often we work together with people that don't share our cultural norms and values. Especially in the business world, what can we do? I think one of the things we can do is to act with cultural intelligence. And here I don't mean a certain way of intelligence that you can compare with IQ. It's not so easy to measure, but I think it was already mentioned before. Leading or cooperating with cultural intelligence is currently a very key issue when it comes to international success. So what I can share with you in the upcoming 10 or 15 minutes is the way we usually work with that, which is built out of 3 different steps. The first one being culture is part of who you are. However, we tend to think that our culture is normal. And with normal, I mean it cannot be challenged, it's just the way it is. So usually if you get a question asking somebody, for example, can you please explain to me what are your norms at work? It will be silent for quite some time, because since we are so used to our own norms and values, we tend to completely forget they actually exist and we just see them as normal behavior. We are only surprised to find our culture is biased in that way if we meet people who are not from the same culture and we suddenly find ourselves surrounded by aliens, like in this little picture. But be careful, we are also very alien to others. So our work always starts with a little bit of self-reflection, offering a mirror, saying, let's see first, what is your cultural self? Besides the fact that you're unique as a person, what cultural sauce defines you in what context? And in our work, we specifically look at business culture. So how do we work together? How do we prefer to lead? How do we make decisions? How do we organize meetings? Things like this. If we have created awareness for our own cultural self, we tend to be more open to look at the world from an appreciative perspective. So looking at differences from an appreciative view, looking at what we can learn from it and how it can help us. And Karsten, I was surprised to hear you also use the metaphor talking about how we can eat a whole elephant. And you said that you need to have a breakdown in independent parts, but that they are still complementary, and maybe this little story will interest you. It's a metaphor for many things. I use it for cross-cultural communication, and it's an old story that is coming from either China or Japan. Both countries claim it's there, so this is already a very nice beginning of cross-cultural diversity. The story goes that there is a group of monks that are all blind and live together in the woods. And someday they decide to take a walk, but since they are blind, they usually hold each other's hand until they find something that's blocking their way and they have to go around. And this day something really big is blocking their way. And since they cannot look and see what it is, they decide to stretch their arms and describe to each other what they feel. And one feels something that's really thin and long, starts above his head and goes down to his feet, and he says, well, I think I know what it is. It must be a snake. And some other monk says, are you insane? Are you crazy? It's clearly not a snake, because he is feeling something much bigger. It's like a trunk, and he believes it's a tree. So he says, it cannot be a snake. We're being held up by a tree. And then somebody else says, you both are completely insane. I feel something much harder. It's rounding up. I think it has to be something much bigger than that. Maybe somebody built a wall in the middle of the forest. And all these monks get in a huge fight until they discover, of course, at some point they need each other's. They need each other's perspectives. They need each other's little chunks of the elephant to understand that we are talking about an elephant. To me, this is illustrating a very important thing when it comes to cross-cultural communication and cooperation in general. While they were all accurate, none of them was wrong. However, they were not complete. And this is, I think, what happens a lot to us when we cooperate in a cross-cultural environment. We tend to be so sure that we are right that we cannot even hear or see other people's perspectives. What we try to do is to find a way to show them that they will need each other's perspectives to see the whole elephant and create really value by listening to each other. To do that, you need to have some creative perception, which means that you are open enough to look at other people's opinion from their view, and finally, of course, also to not immediately express our judgment. I like to call it postponing judgment, but it's very hard to do so. We all have an opinion about everything, but we can choose not to express it right away. And if we succeed at that, if we can become aware of our own cultural self, then look at the others with a more appreciative view and look at what we can learn from each other, then it's not a choice. We don't have to make a choice between my view or your view. We can really work together, combine the different strengths, and I call it authentic reconciliation. I'll give you an example a little bit later on of how we don't have to think in win or lose, either or, but when we can really combine and create a win-win strategy for everyone. In our workshops and trainings and coaching, we work with a model called the model of freedom. It's called the model of freedom because we believe that culture is always setting limits. Every culture is designed to help people collaborate in an effective manner, and depending on a lot of contextual factors, every culture, also business cultures, have found their own way of dealing with all the problems that they have in the world. The minute we have to work with different people, the minute we exist with different people, there are some agreements necessary on how we deal with each other in this culture. All these different dimensions that you can see, these orientations, action, role, process, task, are in all of us. However, cultures do differ in where they prefer to start and how they feel a limitation to their freedom feels free. This sounds a little bit strange because freedom is often a word that we use around the world. However, it's not a culturally neutral term. My freedom may not be exactly the same as your freedom, which is okay, because if we can value these differences, we can move on to understanding each other's freedom and actually creating an elephant that we would never have seen by ourselves. I would like to walk with you through these different orientations to give you a taste of how we work with it. I just want to stretch that this model is not meant to categorize people or box people into specific little boxes. Again, we all recognize all 4 orientations in this model. However, different business cultures usually have a preference to start at a certain point. So we're looking at preferred starting points of how to do business, where sometimes miscommunications and misunderstandings arise. The main horizontal line in this model is a difference between task-oriented cultures and role-oriented cultures. Again, please do not look at this as 2 complete opposites. They are not. Why not? Because every role-oriented culture also has to achieve tasks. It just means they prefer to start with looking at what can we do as a group to achieve this task. On the other hand, task-oriented cultures are not just focused on the individual and the task, because you always have to work together to get to a task. However, cultures do differ in where they prefer to start. Some cultures prefer to start at the role side. They believe it's the most important thing to look at what their role is in the group, how they fit in, and what they can do and offer to the group in order to make a success out of whatever project they're doing together. Behavior you could recognize in cultures who prefer to start on the role side is very disciplined behavior, conforming to group norms, not really speaking up on their own opinion if it's not contributing anything to the task. Really looking after each other, so instead of the blame games, they really look at the group for any task that they have accomplished, either a failure or a success, so they share responsibility. On the task side, we see a different kind of preference. The individual is more important, and basically these people in these cultures feel that they have the right to speak up, and they have the right to do things in their own way, look after themselves and decide for themselves. It doesn't mean these people do not cooperate, they do, but when they, for example, have a common task to do, they tend to divide tasks, split up, go all together, and then come back. In a role-oriented culture, this would not look the same. Collaboration would be very different and would really be done together without splitting up, where they can really share responsibility and there is no individual responsible for a specific part of the task. This has some consequences for preferences of communication. In task-oriented cultures, it's appreciated to speak up and also be very clear and direct. However, in a role-oriented culture, this is very different. Why? Because as the first priority, it's important for them that the group feels comfortable. So they have to make sure that everyone feels that they can be part of the group, so conflicts are usually avoided, which helps a lot if you communicate in a more indirect fashion so you don't offend anyone. I have a question for you. I'm not sure if you can react on the system. If you can, please feel free. I always use this example just to show what is normal. It depends a lot on where you were born. So communication with a new business relation should be about the business. If he or she keeps inviting you for city tours, tea, dinner, it's a sign there's just no business there and you should give up. If you tend to answer, well, yeah, I kind of agree with this, then it probably means that you have a preference to start on the task side. You believe that business should not be about all the chit-chat around it. This is very much a role-oriented way of looking at business, or a task-oriented way of looking at business. And if you work with people who are more role-oriented, this can be very strange and also difficult to explain to management. Why do you have to go to Europe, to Dubai or the Emirates, to drink tea, to play golf, to go sand dune driving, while actually you've been there 3 or 4 times and the topic of business hasn't even come up yet? But be careful, it also works the other way around. Communication with a new business relationship is all about building trust. If he or she wants to meet you at the airport for a short meeting, only has an hour between flights, it's a sign there's just no business here and you should give up. Well, if you are from a role-oriented culture, it can be very strange to work with people who think efficiency, meaning saving time and saving cost, can be the best way of working. Again, this is completely related to what strategy works best. How can we convince our customers that the way we work is the best way? So think about this. If you recognize yourself in one of the other, it is probably an indication that you have a preference for either task-oriented or role-oriented cultures, but you don't have to make a choice. We're all human beings that see a little bit of both. On the top side of the model, you saw a little bit about action. This can be split up in two different leadership styles. I will not go into this too much, but I want to show you a little bit what's behind. Again, please, normally our cultural effectiveness day trainings are about 2 days. I'm trying to push this all in a few minutes. Basically, the difference in two preferred ways of leadership is different cultures do not agree on what is a good leader. Some say a good leader is an achieved leader. The top example, like Oprah Winfrey. It doesn't matter where you come from. If you work hard, you can achieve anything you like. You can become a leader no matter what, and it also means you can be challenged. This leader, him or herself, will also be very challenging to their team. On the other hand, we have ascribed leaders, leaders who are getting there because of their last name, their gender, or anything else that they have by nature. An ascribed authority is there because of who they are, not because of what they do. So that means they don't have to be challenged and they cannot be challenged. Also, they have different goals. An ascribed leader has as a goal to maintain stability and make sure there's harmony in the group, and he or she is protecting their team or their colleagues from let's say all threats in the organization and in the outside world, so people can work on their expertise. In an achieved type of authority, these kind of cultures have a very different priority. They work with challenging, empowering, risk-taking, and they also give full responsibility and they delegate full responsibility to their team members. Ascribed leaders don't do that. They only delegate tasks. On the lower part of the model, we talked about processes. Communication here is a very important topic. Just to give you an example, in simple systems, it means that complexity and context is not seen as something very important. This means that these people can take decisions very fast, because if there is some kind of rule that can be applied, it can just be put in and done, and you don't have to think about it too much. It doesn't mean these people do not think. It just means that these people prefer to start by doing stuff and later on find out if it worked or not, and they can always tweak it. In complex cultures, so the one more down, you can see that these people believe the world is too complex to just make a fast decision. They believe they should always encounter all the context, consider all the context, discuss with other people, and do a lot of analysis before they can take a decision. If these two kind of cultures meet, you can see very clearly that an action-oriented culture is combining an achieved leadership style with simple processes. A process-oriented style is combining ascribed authority with complex processes. This is also what we find a lot in the business world as one of the main conflicts, one of the main disagreements, where people do not agree on what is the most important. Do we have to start by doing things, or should we start by thinking first? It means that they have different definitions of how bad it is if we make a mistake, how long preparation should take, how much information is needed to take a decision, and I could go on for a long time. I think what the main message is that I have is that, of course, both have a lot of disadvantages, but also a lot of advantages. And I will give you an example later how this could bring something to the team that's more than they could have together. So together, these people can see a whole elephant, but both of them are so convinced that the half of the elephant is enough. It's sometimes not so easy to collaborate. So think about this situation. This is a real-life story. I changed a little bit the nationalities. I don't want you to make sure that who it is. But after years of negotiation, a US-based company established a joint venture with a Spanish counterpart. You present yourselves as partners to the press. So imagine you're there, everyone is there with their microphones and their cameras onto you. You're the American counterpart, and then you see your Spanish counterpart tearing up the contract. What does this mean? Well, when this happened in real life, the US-based company thought they'd wanted to get out of the contract and that they decided not to do it anymore, and they felt really cheated that this happened in front of the cameras. But what actually happened was that for them, contracts are useless. Why? Because first of all, it's all in the relationship, so it's not about a piece of paper. Trust is not built through contracts. And on the second hand, context for them was changing all the time anyway. Spanish people will score much more deep into processes, meaning that there is nothing ever completely sure. There will always be renegotiation, and in order to do so, a contract will change anyway, which means we don't need a formalization of our distrust. We need a formalization of trust, and this for them was a symbol of that. So all intentions were good, but you can probably imagine that this didn't always sell very well, especially in front of the press. Maybe you can also imagine this situation. What do you think is normal? You rush to be on time to an appointment, let's say an appointment with a colleague. You find yourself waiting for 2 hours, and then your colleague arrives, and he explains that he met an old friend and could not just ignore him on the street. Is he just disrespecting you, or could it be something else? Again, here the question is, how flexible do people deal with time, with punctuality? What is the right way? And nowadays, of course, the main answer would be, well, at least he could have give us a call. But this is not about calling or not. It's about, is the fact that you meet somebody else, another human being on the street, is there enough flexibility to see that, yes, this is worth being late for? And then, of course, how late is late? Is 2 hours late? In India, 2 days late may not even be late. So again, depending on the context, different interpretations of time, different interpretations of trust, different interpretations of how to deal with all kinds of ways of talking, all kinds of ways of communicating, how we divide tasks, how we divide responsibilities, is costing sometimes a lot of extra effort to work in cross-cultural teams. Now it's very easy to, if you complete this model, to say, well, actually all of them have disadvantages, because these action-oriented people, you cannot work with them. They just make a lot of mistakes. They don't seem to think before they act. These process-oriented people, you can completely forget about them. If you leave them alone, they just talk and never make a decision. These task-oriented people, they're so direct. They just do their own way, and actually they're pretty rude. And on the role-oriented side, they are even worse, because they never tell you what they think, so they cannot be trusted at all. Of course, what I hope is that you will probably look with me and see the advantages as well. Can you also see that an action-oriented culture is very entrepreneurial, very creative, risk-taking, and that it can be balanced by working with people with a more process-oriented attitude, where their goal is to make sure that they take calculated risks, so there is not an either-or choice. The same with task and role. It can be nice to be outspoken. It can be great to be direct. On the other hand, discipline and implementation also pose a very big advantage in teamwork. So what we do now with this model, one of the things we do is measuring different scores. We can do that on an individual level, team level, corporate level, but we also have average business scores of country cultures. This is just the UK to share with you. As you can see, very high preference for action orientation, meaning they will start first by doing stuff and not so much by preparing. The action orientation indicates they are risk takers, they are fast decision makers, they are not afraid of taking responsibility for their successes and for their faults, and they have a preferred leadership style of achievement. On the other hand, for example, here is the profile of France, so the national business culture profile of France. High on task, high on processes, but with a preference for ascribed orientation, meaning they are outspoken people that need a lot of time to think before they act, but they also expect their boss to protect them. So this is a little bit interesting, because you can see on the one hand they believe they have the right to speak up, on the other hand they have a profile which does not allow them to speak up to their bosses. Well, enough about France. I think this is always an interesting culture to talk about, but even more interesting is, imagine a UK manager working with a French team. This is a real-life situation we encounter a lot, where, as you can see on the top half, the action half, there is a very different perception of what is good leadership, and in the low half you can see there is a very big difference in what is perceived as enough information before going ahead and act on something. You could say this is impossible, it's very difficult. Yeah, it is very difficult. But if you are aware of this, if you are aware of this difference, and you can take the next step to open your eyes to the possibilities, you can also see that in potential you have people scoring high on action, task, process and role. So together they can see a whole elephant. Together they have the potential for a high performance team. Together they have the potential to serve many more customer needs and come up with many more strategies than they could do on their own. To finalize this, Awareness is a starting point, appreciation is a second point, but then how do you get to a real decision? Well, one of the things is to let go of looking at differences as a problem. This is polarity management by Barry Johnson. We use it a lot in our work. It's about reconciling differences without even agreeing on the problem. Sometimes you don't have to. Imagine this culture A and B, so the yellow and the blue one, who completely disagree on their advantages and disadvantages. The red arrows indicate usually where we start. If I'm from culture B and I believe details and analysis are very important, and I see somebody else who's making mistakes, I will point to that. I will tell them, look, you're making way too many mistakes. This is your disadvantage. The other side as well, the orange culture, who is really into risk-taking and fast decision-making, will think I'm way too slow and will tell me what my disadvantages are. What I hope to bring you with this is a reconciliation method looking at the green arrows. How can we find a way in which both our advantages are basically making our disadvantages no longer relevant? And if we're a bit creative with these arrows, you can see that this creates an infinite sign. Infinity. We never have to end this. There is not one solution. There are many ways to get to a solution, and depending on the context, it might be more important to be risk-taking. In another one, it might be more important to have a look for details. Depending on your industry, can you imagine culture A being a pharmaceutical profession? I really hope not. Same for B. If you're on a ship in its sinking, I would rather have the captain make a fast decision without first looking at all the details. So depending on where you are, you will find this balance. And it is still not one solution, but it is a dynamic balance, which means depending on the context, depending on what is necessary, you can decide for yourself. Am I in a red arrow, or am I trying to look at advantages, and am I on the green way? This also goes for strategy makers. Different ways of looking at the same thing is exactly portrayed by this model, I would say. It's not only about finding multiple solutions, it's also about finding multiple problems. The advantage of diversity in teams is that they have the luxury of never having no problem, which means there is always room for innovation. Thank you very much. I hope you will think about this a little bit more, how to combine apples and oranges without losing anything. My advice would always be never adapt, always adopt. Adopt with an O, just like you would adopt a child in your family. It means you don't have to become something you're not. Stay who you are, but you can always add new parts of the elephant, new oranges. Thank you very much for hanging in there with me. Thank you very much, Karsten. I give you back the stage.